Hey guys, welcome back to the Spectre Creative Channel. I'm a LEGO representation of Scott Toy Guru Knightlick. One of the big things I try to do on this channel is to answer questions about toy collecting from the inside, having actually worked in the toy industry, in addition to being a collector my whole life. And one of the big questions I get all the time is, why can't we just make these darn action figures or toys in general in the United States? Why do they have to be made in China? Couldn't it be easier to distribute? You don't have to ship that way. Well, this is a complicated issue, and it has to do with the closure of a lot of U.S. manufacturing. I mean, it's not just the toy industry, but almost every major U.S. manufacturing industry or type have seen radical closures over the last 20 to 30 years. I saw this with my father-in-law, who worked in the fabric industry, as mill after mill in America closed and moved production overseas. And while the textile industry hasn't been able to recover from this fully, the toy industry has found a few ways to make toys in the US. But if you notice, almost every toy that's made in the US doesn't have removable parts, has very little or if no deco, and is usually made out of materials like wood or even paper and cardboard. Doing complicated manufacturing like plastic injection molding requires overseas development and production. But why is this? Why can't we just make plastic injection molded machines here? Or not machines, but product. Well, it has to do with partially with how much we pay ourselves. U.S. minimum wage has increased greatly in the last 20 years, while I think it's still hovering around something about 7.25 nationally. If you look at something like Starbucks, they now pay $15 an hour to their baristas, and I've seen my white chocolate mocha go from about $5 to $8.50 in the last few years because the cost has to be passed along. Versus the average salary in China, unlike the US minimum wage, is, well, less. For example, most Chinese workers are making less than $4 an hour. Now, this is obviously a very different livable wage because it doesn't cost as much to live in China. But if you look at, say, a $25 action figure, which is what people are asking, can't this be made in the US? Well, if you do just, simple ratio math and compare the US minimum wage, let's call it the $15 an hour that Starbucks pays, to what you pay in China, that means a 6-inch figure, if it was made in the US, paying that minimum wage, would cost $106. Are you prepared to pay $106 for Iron Spider-Man? Maybe not. I mean, some of us do with those, Japanese toys that are really cool, but your average figure sold at Target isn't going to survive like that. Now, a lot of this has to do with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. For those of you unfamiliar with NAFTA, and I'm not going to do a whole history, you can see plenty of videos on YouTube, it was signed into law by President Bill Clinton in the early 90s. And originally the intent was to create trade between China, Mexico, and the US, but it had a lot of other secondary repercussions, shall we say. And a lot of that was like dropping a giant wrecking ball on US manufacturing, where suddenly U.S. factory owners had the ability to move production overseas. And you just saw hundreds of thousands of jobs leave the U.S., and a lot of them did go overseas to China, where it costs a lot less to pay a worker. And there's a big movement to bring manufacturing back to America again in order to employ American workers. And there's also talks about things like having robots build things like Lego does. Lego has been very successful having machine-based factories in the US and Europe producing all of their Lego sets. There are some workers that are needed for quality control and for maintenance, but for the most part, Lego factories are done totally automated. And again, that's because we're just dealing with slug pieces. There's no assembly, there's no manufacturing, there's no paint. Versus most toys that are made in China require that. They require assembly. They require fabric, stitching, paint, deco, all sorts of things that are a lot harder to do than simply pumping out Lego blocks or Lincoln Logs. Painting especially is incredibly expensive. Every time a paintbrush touches a toy, it is charged to the manufacturer. And while we sometimes think this is done by machines or stickers, it really isn't. Almost every toy is painted by hand in China. And as it was noted in the Andor series, using humans is actually a lot less expensive often than using droids or, robots or automated factories like Lego uses. Every one of those eyebrows, those pupils, they're all painted by hand, and that's one of the reasons it costs so much. So, can we bring jobs back to the US? I mean, obviously, that would be fantastic. But I think a lot of it is looking at us more as a global economy and bringing the entire planet forward. And you may laugh about this, but I've always felt that the solution to manufacturing, cost of living, all of this really comes down to space travel. And I know you're like, wait, what are you talking about? Well, like Fry mentioned in the first episode of Futurama, space is enormous. And at the very end, there's usually a monkey throwing barrels at you. Okay, well, besides that, space also contains a huge amount of raw materials. And we're talking about everything from gold to platinum to iron. The ores that are out there on asteroids and other planets is infinite. And it's suddenly like we just kind of stopped exploring as a human species. Once we had everything mapped back in the Age of Discovery, and yes, I know there were some negative consequences with indigenous populations, but I'm not getting into something political. I just want to talk about the concept of actually looking for new resources. We're not talking about, the horrible aspects of what happened to indigenous. So hopefully, as a species, we've learned from that, and when we now come into contact with new indigenous species, well, we'll actually befriend them instead of giving them, horrible diseases and, taking away their land. We can share. There's a lot of space out there, and there's enough for all of us. So yeah, I know this video started off saying, why can't toys get produced in the US? And I think the answer is because they would be too expensive. But the bigger issue is all of this can absolutely be solved if we would just explore a little bit more. Or, you could pay $106 for a Marvel Legends figure. It's kind of your choice. But I hope that humanity as a whole would start looking for more resources that could benefit the planet as a total. It's going to help everybody, and it's going to make life, well, a lot better because there's an infinite number of resources. We don't need to be limited just what's on this planet. All right, I know this video is a little all over the place, but I hope I at least answered why toy manufacturing isn't done in the US and gave a little bit of my own soapbox about exploration. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree? Disagree? Love to know in the comments below. And as always, any help sharing this video is most appreciated. It's the best way to show support for this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.